You know, it's absolutely fascinating to think that right inside your cells is the ultimate historical and forensic record book. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the world of genetic engineering. We aren't just talking about basic biology here. We're looking at how invisible clues can solve modern mysteries, trace ancient histories, and actually unlock the very origins of humanity. Here's our investigation board for today's explainer. We're looking at your DNA, your ID. Then, the crime scene, taking a journey to the past, breaking down two types of DNA, and finally exploring the human family tree. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. Your DNA, your ID.
To really get the big picture here, think of your DNA as a microscopic ID card that you literally leave everywhere you go. Now, you might be wondering, wait, don't humans share almost all of our DNA? And, well, yeah, we do. But look at that 0.1% genetic difference. It sounds tiny, right? But that tiny fraction of the human genome is responsible for every single one of your unique genetic traits. And that fractional difference, that's exactly what forensic scientists zero in on to successfully tell one suspect from another. To put that into perspective, when you look at the raw numbers, that 0.1% is actually massive. The human genome contains a staggering 3.2 billion characters. That's longer than a whole set of encyclopedias. So if you calculate 0.1% of 3.2 billion, you realize there's plenty of room for unique, individual combinations. Every time humans reproduce, the mix of the father's and mother's DNA creates entirely new, basically infinite combinations within those characters. Moving on to Section 2, the crime scene. So how in the world do we actually read these massive genetic encyclopedias when all we have is a tiny, fragile clue like a single eyelash? Well, it takes immense precision. First off, the delicate biological evidence has to be meticulously collected and stored by forensics. If it's mishandled, it degrades or gets contaminated and the trail goes cold. Now, check out the second step here, PCR, or polymerase chain reaction. Because crime scene samples are usually incredibly small, PCR acts like a biological photocopier. It multiplies those tiny DNA fragments millions of times until there's actually enough material to sequence and compare against a pool of suspects. And honestly, this technology has completely transformed criminal justice. The very first time DNA analysis solved a crime was back in 1986 for a double murder in Leicestershire, England. Since then, the forensic collection and amplification methods have improved so drastically that today, investigators are actually reopening and solving cold cases all the way from the 1950s. Modern advanced techniques can even help identify a suspect's facial features or hair color just from a genetic sample. It's really incredible. But the really crucial point here is just how creative scientists have become with all this data. Look at this fascinating UK study. Researchers figured out a technique to literally predict a criminal's last name from a drop of DNA. How? Well, they analyzed the Y chromosome, which is passed directly from fathers to sons, which, is exactly the same way surnames are traditionally passed down. By matching specific Y chromosome traits to specific lineages, they can link DNA to a family name. Obviously, they have to exclude super common names like Smith or Taylor, but even then, this technique can narrow down the suspect pool for about 40% of British men. That is a massive head start. Section 3, Journey to the Past. So, having looked at modern true crime, it begs the question, how far back in time can our genetic tools actually take us? It's the ultimate pop culture question, right? If we can pull DNA from a 1950s cold case, could we ever extract dinosaur DNA from millions of years ago to build a real-life Jurassic Park? Well, I hate to break it to the movie fans, but cloning a T-Rex is totally impossible. Dinosaur DNA is over 65 million years old. After that much time, the genetic material is just completely corrupted. We don't have a single sample well preserved enough to read even one gene, let alone an entire genome. But mammoth DNA, that is a completely different story, because mammoths lived much more recently, around 43,000 years ago, and their remains were naturally preserved in freezing Siberian ice. Expert researcher Carlos Lalaweza-Fox was actually able to extract and successfully sequence their DNA. And because they sequenced that mammoth DNA, we learned something pretty amazing. Scientists pinpointed an essential gene related to hair pigmentation. By analyzing it, they could figure out the actual coat colors of these ancient giants. And as it turns out, the creators of the animated movie Ice Age 2 were incredibly accurate when they drew their mammoths with varying coat colors. Some were dark, some were light, and some were even reddish. Who knew, right?
Okay, let's look at section 4, 2 types of DNA.
To understand how we solve these historical mysteries, especially with highly degraded DNA, we have to recognize that our cells actually contain 2 completely different types. On the left here, we have nuclear DNA. This is located right in the nucleus. We only have 1 copy per cell, and we inherit it equally from both our father and mother. It's the DNA that determines our physical traits. But on the right, we have mitochondrial DNA. Now, mitochondria are basically the energy-producing factories of our cells, and millions of years ago, they were actually independent, free-living bacteria. Because of that wild history, they have their very own DNA. Crucially, there are thousands of copies of mitochondrial DNA per cell, which makes it way easier to find integrated ancient samples. Plus, at the moment of fertilization, only the mother's egg provides mitochondria. So, mitochondrial DNA is passed down strictly and reliably from mothers to their children, with absolutely zero genetic mixing from the father.
Let's see how this highly conserved mitochondrial DNA solves real-world historical puzzles. Scientists at the UAB applied this exact science to identify victims of the Spanish Civil War found in mass graves, like the one in Berlangas de Roa. Because those bones were old and degraded, they went straight for the plentiful mitochondrial DNA. Then they compared it to living relatives. But remember, this only works for the direct maternal line. In one really fascinating instance, they successfully identified the remains of a former mayor's son by matching the DNA to his living sister, since they shared the same mother. But they couldn't identify the mayor himself using his daughter's DNA. Why? Because her mitochondrial DNA came from the mayor's wife, not from him. It's like a giant biological puzzle.
Now, before we move on to our grand finale, we do need to highlight a quick but absolutely vital caveat. Despite its incredible investigative power, whether we're talking about modern forensics or historical grave sites, DNA testing measures statistical probabilities. It is vulnerable to contamination and human errors, so it should never be treated as an absolute, 100% infallible certainty. It's a remarkably powerful tool for sure, but it's not magic. Which brings us to Section 5, the human family tree. Taking the final step in our zoom-out journey, we can actually apply population genetics to map out the entire evolutionary family tree of humanity. By sequencing DNA from hundreds of populations worldwide, scientists have traditionally debated 2 major theories about our origins. On the left, you've got the replacement theory, or out of Africa, which argues that modern humans emerged in Africa around 200,000 years ago, expanded globally, and completely replaced older human species. On the right is the multi-regional theory. This one suggests an older human ancestor expanded 1.5 million years ago, and various populations across the globe basically evolved together into Homo sapiens through continuous interbreeding. Today, thanks to all this genetic evidence, modern science favors a synthesis. We are primarily African in origin, but we carry a small percentage of genetic heritage from other ancient human species that we encountered along the way.
And that synthesis brings us to this incredibly profound concept, the mitochondrial Eve. Remember how we talked about mitochondrial DNA being passed down unbroken from mother to child? Well, in 1987, researchers tracing these genetic lineages backward made a stunning discovery. The mitochondrial DNA of every single modern human alive today traces back to one single female ancestor who lived in Africa roughly 200,000 years ago. Now, it doesn't mean she was the only woman alive at the time, but her specific maternal lineage is the only one that survived unbroken to the present day. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this awe-inspiring thought. The ultimate crime scene clue, your DNA, is also an ancient record book proving that every single person you have ever met is profoundly, biologically connected to one ancient mother. Kind of makes you look at the person sitting next to you a bit differently, doesn't it? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.